Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Day in History, our nightly look back at a specific day in history, where we take a look back at the events of a day, the historical context in which those events took place, and the historic ramifications of those events. As always, if you have not yet, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell notification icon to be alerted anytime I post new content, and tell a friend. And without any further ado, this day in history, May the 8th. And on this day, in 1884, in Lamar, Missouri, Harry S. Truman was born. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, serving from April 1945 until January 1953, is a very consequential president, not just for the events of his administration, but the breadth of them. Truman took office on April 12, 1945, after the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a subject we covered earlier. However, I want to focus not on Roosevelt and his demise now, but the man that followed him, Truman. Truman, as I said, became president in mid-April 1945. Less than 1 month later, the war in Europe would end. Tomorrow, May 9th, is traditionally celebrated as VE Day in Europe, Victory in Europe Day. In the wonderful HBO film Truman, Gary Sinise, who played Harry Truman, is portrayed bringing some leftover cake down to the White House kitchen, birthday cake that they had made for the president to share with the staff. And he plays something on the radio. It's the victory announcement. And one of the cooks begins to cry and says that her son is in the Pacific. And the president informs her that they're going to bring her son home real soon, too. That war's going to come to an end. Of course, by this time, Truman had been made aware of what he was not aware of as vice president, the development of the atomic bomb, which Truman would face the decision of whether or not to use in August of 1945. And Truman, of course, made the decision to drop the bomb and use it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Fat Man and Little Boy. And that is a decision that has just been discussed and been debated throughout history. And we will cover that in August, on the day of the bombing. We'll discuss the pros, the cons, the ramifications, and what could have happened. But back to Truman. Truman is also very consequential because not only was he a wartime president, but he was a post-war president as well. Truman, along with Churchill and Mackenzie King and others, Joseph Stalin included, faced the task of putting the world back together again after this Great War. Less than 20 years had passed since the end of World War I and the outbreak of World War II. And now, less than 30 years after the end of World War II, they are once again, having to put back the pieces of a Europe and a world broken apart by war. And in some respects, they make some good decisions. And in some respects, they make some bad decisions. throughout history, you can find examples of people making momentously great decisions and momentously bad. And in the same instance, they can do both. I believe that the Marshall Plan was a tremendous success. NATO is another success. I think that Truman should have pushed harder, possibly against the Soviet line, instead of conspiring much of Eastern Europe to the rule of the Iron Curtain. But Truman was also aware of how much war weary the world was. Truman pursued civil rights. He was the first president. Roosevelt pursued it on the fringes, but Truman pursued integration of the armed forces. And this was quite shocking to some, considering the fact that Truman was from Missouri, which was considered a southern state at the time. And Truman had flirted with joining the Ku Klux Klan as a young man. He did not. Truman pursued the integration of the armed forces. This caused and pursued civil rights legislation in the Democratic Party platform in 1948. This caused the Southern delegations at the Democratic National Convention to walk out and form their own party, the Dixiecrats. And they would run the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, for president. And he would receive some electoral votes. He carried some southern states. Truman did not appear on those ballots. You also have the fact that Truman had a war himself that he fought. The Korean War, after South Korea was invaded by the North. And the United Nations, which the U.S. helped lead those forces, beat back the North Koreans to the 38th parallel. And the DMZ was created. And the effects of that are still being felt today, as the Kim family, who was the ruling party in North Korea at the time, still rules. The grandson of Kim Il-sung is the leader of North Korea, the supreme leader, Kim Jong-un. And his father, Kim Jong-il, was Kim Il-sung's son. So we have remnants of Truman's legacy there. Truman got his start in politics as a county judge in Missouri, which is the equivalent in most states of a county commissioner. He was in the Kansas City machine, which was ran by Pendergrass, Tom Pendergrass. He had been a failed haberdasher. His store had fallen on hard times after the war. He then was elected to the United States Senate in 1934 and would serve there for the next decade before being elected vice president in 1945 for the final term of President Roosevelt. He replaced Vice President Wallace, who many were concerned about him possibly becoming president with Roosevelt's death. And there was even great concern that if Roosevelt didn't make it to the inauguration, that Wallace, for a short time, would be president. So that is there is that. Truman was also one of the first presidents to pursue a very bold internationalist foreign policy, and this is something I admire about Truman. I admire many things about Truman. I believe he's one of the greatest presidents this country's ever had. he's definitely in the top 10. Um, I am totally against isolationism. I think isolationism is a failed foreign policy that has many failures throughout history that you can just point to. But when America leads bold and big on the world stage, good things happen. And I am very, very fond of his embrace of this. Also, Truman was a big accountability man. He had famously on the Oval Office desk, "The buck stops here." A little piece of wood that let people know that responsibility ultimately lied with him. Truman is also responsible for renovating the White House. When he and Mrs. Truman moved into the White House was in very big need of repair and renovation. It was said to be a fire hazard. He and Mrs. Truman relocated to Blair House for a majority of his first term in office, and that is when the renovations of the White House took place. Truman won a very large and one of the biggest presidential upsets in history. In 1948, most people believed that Thomas Dewey, who had been the Republican standard bearer in 1944, would defeat him. And Truman went on a whistle-stop tour, made the Republican-controlled Congress his personal punching bag, as they were very obstructionist and, as he said, the do-nothing Congress, and rallied support to his cause and won election. And of course, there's the famous picture of him with the early edition of the Chicago Tribune, which in fact, not many of those copies actually made it to the street, by the way. Dewey defeats Truman. So you have that. Truman was wanted to pursue re-election in 1952. He was eligible to seek re-election, but he had fallen on some very unpopular poll numbers and did not. And Adlai Stevenson would become the Democratic standard bearer, and Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower would defeat Adlai Stevenson and become president. Truman left office incredibly unpopular and mostly seen as a failure as president. Luckily, Truman has gotten a reevaluation in history and taken his rightful place as recognized as one of the better presidents this country's ever had. Truman fell on hard times financially as president in his post-presidency, and this hard times led to the creation of the post-presidential pension. And Herbert Hoover, who was a multimillionaire, only accepted his pension so Truman wouldn't feel guilty about taking his pension. So a lot of change came out of the Truman years. Some of it good, some of it bad. Like every president, there's a mixed legacy. But I believed it was important to focus on this very consequential and momentous man in history. Truman would pass away in 1972, one day after Christmas. And He is buried in his hometown of Independence, Missouri, in the courtyard of the Harry Truman Presidential Library and Museum. I hope y'all all have a great night and a good day.